Can you imagine a world divided by ideologies, where every move on the global stage was a strategic chess move? A global history. We explore the dramatic confrontation that defined the 20th century. Discover how the nuclear arms race and proxy conflicts shaped international relations, and learn about key elements like the Korean War and the space race. Get ready to dive deep into one of history's most compelling narratives. The Cold War was a post-World War II confrontation between two superpowers of the world, the Soviet Union and the United States of America. Although they did not engage in a direct battle, they encouraged many other countries to join their respective sides. Both sides accumulated large stockpiles of weapons, including lethal ones such as nuclear missiles. This rivalry between the superpowers led to many smaller wars around the world. The Cold War was a major event in the history of the world, and its influence is still seen in the present. This conflict started immediately after the Second World War, though the animosity had been simmering for years. Western countries had been concerned with communism right from the time of the Russian Revolution in 1917. The United States, in particular, had a strong belief in free enterprise and democracy, which was quite the opposite of communism as practiced by the Soviet Union. Despite the fact that the US and its allies fought alongside the USSR during the Second World War against Germany, this alliance was not permanent. After the end of the Second World War, the Western powers did not require the support of the Soviet Union anymore, and thus relations between the two sides deteriorated. During the last days of the Second World War, when the Allies were approaching Berlin, the fate of Europe after the war was being decided. Germany was split between the Russians, Americans, French, and the British, and this was the case during the Cold War. Berlin emerged as a focal point of the Cold War when Americans stood in the way of Soviet attempts to prevent Germans from escaping to the West. Germany and the USSR had been enemies in a very destructive war, and many Germans were afraid of Soviet occupation. The Western powers wanted the Germans to form their own government as soon as possible, but Stalin made East Germany into a satellite state and wanted to eliminate the Allies. The Soviet Union surrounded Berlin in June 1948 and closed all the roads and railways to the American-occupied West Berlin. In response, the Western powers airlifted 13,000 tons of supplies, known as the Berlin Airlift. The USSR lifted the blockade in 1949, but Berlin remained divided until 1989. After Germany was destroyed, the majority of Western soldiers returned home, but Soviet forces never left Eastern Europe. They soon established pro-communist regimes in numerous surrounding nations. The astounding onslaught of Soviet dominance prompted British Prime Minister Winston Churchill to declare that an Iron Curtain had fallen across the continent. Tensions were high, but while the Soviets had numerous troops on the ground, the Americans had produced a nuclear weapon during the war, making all-out war unlikely. Unfortunately, to the terror of the Western nations, the Soviet Union successfully field-tested its own nuclear weapon in 1949. To defend themselves against a growing massive communist bloc, the Western nations created an alliance by establishing NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Several years later, in 1955, the Eastern Bloc countries signed the Warsaw Pact, forging their own cohesive alliance. As communism expanded around the world, the Cold War started with a number of proxy wars that took place in many countries. Soon, Asia became one of the most active fronts of the Cold War between communism and the capitalist West. The loss of Japan in the Second World War had left a significant power vacuum in the region, and this had destabilized several countries. In China, Chiang Kai-shek's Nationalist Party was significantly undermined after fighting the Japanese, thus providing Mao Zedong's communist rebels with a civil war advantage. The Communists seized power in China in 1949, and the rest of the nationalists were pushed out to Taiwan, which is still claimed by China up to this date. However, in the neighboring Korea, the country was divided into two halves at the end of the Second World War by Soviet and Western forces, which demarcated the country along the 38th parallel. Inspired by the success of communism in China, North Korea invaded the South, and this led to the deployment of US and 14 other Western countries to defend the government of Seoul. The war was bloody and would culminate in a complete standstill by 1953, a standstill that has not been resolved as of 2021. The same year, The aggressive Soviet premier, Joseph Stalin, died, and there was a change in government policy in the USSR. The new leader of the Soviet Union was Nikita Khrushchev, who had been relatively vocal in his criticism of Stalin. Khrushchev was one of the most energetic and competent leaders of the USSR and began to ease some of the restrictions that Stalin had placed on the economy and the Soviet people. During his presidency, the USSR would experience a massive influx of technology in an effort to combat the culture war against the highly powerful United States. Accelerating the USSR and US in the space race, a technical competition was one of Khrushchev's major accomplishments. Nazi Germany's early rocketry advancements served as a catalyst for the space race. Following the war, German scientists sent as much knowledge as possible to the Soviet Union and the United States. Whereas the Soviets just abducted scientists when they were discovered, the Americans pledged to forget whatever war crimes that Germans who worked for them might have committed. Khrushchev founded the Soviet space program as soon as he learned that the Americans were developing a satellite, even if, at first, the Soviets utilized this stolen technology to build missiles. The Soviets launched their first satellite, Sputnik 1, in 1957, irritating the Americans, who did not launch Explorer 1 until 1958. While the Americans established the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, in 1960, the Soviets would continue to lead the space race for quite some time, sending the first man, Yuri Gagarin, into space in 1961. The competition between the two powers to advance technology would result in several fiery mishaps, as both sides employed untested equipment too early. As Soviet development stagnated in the late 1960s, under new Soviet Premier Brezhnev, the Americans forged forward, landing on the moon in 1969. The early 60s were not only the time of the space race, but also the time of the highest level of Cold War confrontation, the Cuban Missile Crisis. In the 50s, the small Caribbean country of Cuba was ripe for a regime change and was suffering from severe social problems. However, the U.S. feared that any change of the ruling dictator, Batista, would lead to a communist government. When the rebel guerrillas led by Fidel Castro overthrew Batista in Cuba and seized Havana, America was very worried. In 1961, the U.S. attempted to overthrow Castro through the Bay of Pigs invasion, but it turned out to be a disaster. The attack did not succeed, and as a result, Cuba shifted its allegiance to the USSR and formally became a communist country. When Cuba joined the side of the USSR, the latter deployed some of its missiles to the island in 1962. When Americans heard of this, a very dramatic situation of a standoff was created. President Kennedy replied with a live TV address where he stated that if Cuba were to attack the U.S., then the U.S. would retaliate by attacking the USSR, thus leading to a nuclear war. The world watched in anticipation as the two powers engaged in a diplomatic standoff. Finally, it was decided that the USSR would withdraw its weapons if the U.S. would do the same, disassembling important missile sites in Turkey. Today, the Cuban Missile Crisis is still the closest the world has ever come to experiencing a nuclear Armageddon. To prevent the spread of communism, America would intervene in the political affairs of many other nations, as it did with Cuba. The U.S. interfered in the affairs of several Latin American countries in the 20th century, overthrowing governments in Guatemala in 1954 and Grenada in 1983. President Lyndon B. Johnson also invaded the Dominican Republic in 1965 to prevent a communist regime from taking power when the country was in political crisis. President Johnson would gain a reputation as something of a war hawk during the Cold War, and he is famous for his involvement in the bloodiest of all the Cold War conflicts, Vietnam. Vietnam was in much the same situation that Korea had been in, split between an American allied South and a communist North. Still, while America had initially been relatively hands-off about the conflict, by the mid-60s, it seemed as though the South would lose. After a string of attacks on the American military, President Johnson approved the bombing of Vietnam in Operation Rolling Thunder before deploying many more American troops to the country in the summer of 1965. The Vietnam War would turn into a humanitarian crisis, and it is still sadly remembered to this day for the severe psychological trauma that affected the participants of the war. During the war, the Vietnamese communists relied on the jungle to attack the Americans at every chance they got, which is why they are referred to as guerrillas. In response, the Americans started dropping napalm on the Vietnamese that leveled entire villages in a fiery rain. Following the Tet Offensive, a series of spectacular assaults by North Vietnamese, the American anti-war protests reached a crescendo. American troops were gradually withdrawn from Vietnam in the belief that the trained Vietnamese would continue the fight. The government of U.S. President Nixon would escalate the bombing of Vietnam in the 1970s. The Communists in the North and the Viet Cong would eventually eliminate all opposition on the ground by 1975, ending a war that was deeply unpopular. In the 70s, Cold War tensions began to lessen somewhat, due to the fact that both sides wanted to achieve a state of stability and security, which led to a series of negotiations called SALT, or the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. These diplomatic talks were meant to persuade both the US and USSR to limit the number of missiles they possessed. President Nixon also initiated the recognition of China as a diplomatic partner in 1972. Despite being communist, the Chinese government did not see eye to eye with the Soviet Union, and they were happy to forge a new business relationship with America. While it appeared that the battle was calming down, the Soviet Union took the extraordinary step of invading Afghanistan in 1979 to support the communist coup that had occurred there. Reagan used fiery, bellicose language to describe the Soviet Union, and he ramped up the rhetoric about America's war against the evil empire. Reagan's return to Cold War paranoia was deeply polarizing, but he ultimately lived to see the USSR dismantled, which made him extremely popular with many people. Thankfully for Reagan, Mikhail Gorbachev became the Soviet premier in 1985. Gorbachev was from a younger generation, tired of the fact that the Soviet Union was not making the material progress it used to. The Soviets invested 29% of their budget on their military and breadlines. The absence of technological advancement in the previous 2 decades meant that the USSR was significantly behind the West in terms of living standards. In an attempt to solve this problem, in the late 80s, Gorbachev introduced 2 reforms, namely glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. He wanted to liberalize the USSR, increase the freedom of movement, freedom of information, and access to more economic markets to enhance the standard of living of the Soviet citizens. Small private business enterprises were suddenly allowed to bring back market competition, and the press was allowed to publish criticism of the administration. When free elections were gradually being held at many levels of government, it was seen that Gorbachev had built his own tomb. Gorbachev aimed at reforming the USSR, but he did not know that he was actually dismantling it. When people in different parts of the USSR were provided with more information and freedom of choice, they chose to reject communism. Latvia and Lithuania, for instance, which had been part of the USSR for a long time, quickly mobilized for independence. When free movement was declared between East and West Berlin, a group of people broke down the Berlin Wall and embraced their families after years of separation. The USSR's Eastern Bloc allies, including Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Hungary, Albania, and Bulgaria, all overthrew their own communist governments during a stunning wave of popular uprisings in 1988 through 91. Gorbachev's difficult balance between a communist regime and a free market economy sparked upheaval, as many people wanted to adopt Western-style capitalism as quickly as feasible. Gorbachev was quickly deposed when Boris Yeltsin was elected Russian president in 1991. Yeltsin dissolved the Communist Party, demanded more changes, and let numerous countries secede from Russia. The Soviet Union was formally dissolved in 1991, and several democratic nations arose from the wreckage. The Cold War was finally ended.